At my son's wedding, my wife brought him a plate of food because he hadn't eaten all day. When she accidentally stepped on the edge of my daughter-in-law's dress, the girl turned cold and snapped, "Watch where you're going." Then she shoved my wife straight into the mud. My son just made a face and said, "Mom always ruins everything." 300 guests laughed. I helped my wife up, pulled out my phone, and called my lawyer. Their smiles faded fast. Welcome to calm family revenge. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. I'd love to know who's in this with me. Like and subscribe if stories like this speak to you. And one note, some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. Names and places are fictional, but the lesson at the heart of it, that one is yours to keep. The vines at Castello di Napa stretched in perfect rows across the hillside, ancient and unhurried, completely indifferent to the 298 people gathered beneath the June afternoon sun. I had driven nearly 3,000 miles from Savannah, Georgia, to watch my son get married in a place that charged $40 for a glass of wine and called it heritage. The stone pathway wound through the vineyard like something out of a painting, lined with white hydrangeas that must have cost more than my first truck. I straightened my jacket, adjusted the boutonniere Martha had pinned to my lapel that morning, and reminded myself that today was supposed to be a good day. Leonard. Martha appeared at my elbow, her silver dress catching the late afternoon light. She looked beautiful in the quiet, unassuming way she always had, the kind of beautiful that doesn't announce itself. She pressed a glass of sparkling water into my hand. "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" "Standing still and watching everything like you're waiting for something to go wrong." I took a sip of the water. "I'm just taking it all in, Maggie." She tilted her head and gave me the look she had perfected over 41 years of marriage. The one that said she knew exactly what I was thinking and was choosing to be kind about it anyway. "Daniel looks happy," she said softly. "That's what matters today." I looked across the patio to where our son stood near the wine-tasting bar. Daniel was 35 years old and wore his tailored ivory blazer like he had been born in it. He had his arm around Chloe, his new wife of approximately 4 hours, laughing at something her father Edward was saying. Edward Morgan, founder of the Morgan Coastal Hotel Group, owner of 3 boutique properties along the Georgia and South Carolina shoreline, and the most aggressively confident man I had encountered in recent memory. He wore a custom navy suit and the particular smile of a man who believed the world had been specifically arranged for his benefit. "I'll go bring Daniel something to eat," Martha said, already reaching for one of the appetizer trays a caterer had left on the side table. "He hasn't touched a thing since the ceremony." "Maggie, you don't have to. I'm his mother." She picked up the silver tray and gave me a look that closed the conversation entirely. "That's what mothers do." I watched her walk across the stone patio, weaving carefully between clusters of guests in cocktail dresses and linen blazers. She moved with the gentle deliberateness of a woman who had spent a lifetime making sure the people she loved were taken care of, always the one refilling glasses and carrying plates while everyone else celebrated around her. The string quartet shifted into something soft and lilting. Somewhere behind me, 2 of Edward's business associates were arguing cheerfully about bourbon. The late afternoon sun turned the vineyard gold, and then the tray tilted. I saw it happen the way you see a car accident, each fraction of a second, stretched out and terrible. Martha had stepped slightly to her left to let a waiter pass, and the heel of her shoe caught the very edge of Chloe's cathedral-length train, which had pooled across the stone pathway in a sweep of imported silk. It was nothing, a brush of fabric, The kind of thing that happens 100 times at any wedding with a dress that extravagant. Martha spun around immediately, her face already flushing with apology, her free hand reaching out. "Oh goodness, I'm so sorry, sweetheart, I didn't see." Chloe looked down at the hem of her gown. A faint smudge of dust on the very edge of the lace. Nothing that would photograph. Nothing that couldn't be steamed away in 10 minutes. But the expression that crossed Chloe's face was not the expression of a woman who had just had her dress grazed at a garden party. It was the expression of a woman who had decided in that precise moment that she had been deeply and personally wronged. "Are you serious right now?" Chloe's voice came out low and blade sharp, cutting right through the quartet. Martha's hand was still extended in apology. "I am so sorry, I truly didn't." Chloe did not let her finish. She raised both hands and shoved my wife. Not a nudge. Not a startled reaction. Both palms, full force, directly into Martha's shoulders. Martha's heels slipped on the wet stone. The morning rain had left the pathway treacherous in places, and she went over the edge of the patio with a sound that I will carry in my chest until the day I die. She hit the flower bed below with a dense, awful thud, her silver dress swallowed instantly by the dark mud of the rain-soaked soil. 298 people went absolutely still. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. My entire body locked. Martha was on the ground. My wife was on the ground. In the mud. At our son's wedding. I turned to Daniel, my son. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in our Savannah driveway. The boy I had stayed up with through fevers and nightmares and every broken thing that childhood throws at a person. I turned to him because I was certain, I was completely, utterly certain, that he was already moving toward his mother. He was not moving. Daniel looked down at Martha sitting in the mud. He glanced at Chloe. And then the corner of his mouth pulled up and he laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a social reflex. A genuine, easy, unbothered laugh, like he had just heard a decent punchline at a company dinner. Then he leaned toward Chloe and murmured something in her ear. She pressed her lips together, fighting a smile, and then Daniel straightened up and said loud enough for the nearest 24 guests to hear clearly, "Mom always ruins everything." The blood in my veins turned to something cold and very still. My hand lowered the cup to a passing tray without my consciously deciding to do it. My legs were already moving through the parted crowd past the frozen faces down the 2 shallow steps to where my wife sat in the mud with her beautiful silver dress ruined and her eyes blinking rapidly the way a person blinks when they are trying very hard not to cry in front of 300 strangers. I crouched beside her. My knees hit the wet ground, and I did not care even slightly. "Maggie." I pulled the handkerchief from my breast pocket. Her cheek had a streak of dark mud along the jawline. I wiped it away as carefully as I could. Her hands were trembling, fine, barely perceptible tremors, and her eyes were glassy with tears she was refusing to release. "Can you stand?" "I'm fine." Her voice was steady. Too steady. The kind of steady that costs a tremendous amount to maintain. "Let me help you up." I got her to her feet. I straightened her dress as best I could, which was not very much. I took both her hands in mine and looked at her directly and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Go wait by the car, Maggie. Take my jacket. I'll be there in a few minutes." She looked at me. Then she looked past me toward Daniel, who had already turned back to his champagne glass. Something moved across her face that I had never seen there before in 41 years. Not anger. Something worse than anger. Something that looked like a door closing very slowly and very permanently. "Okay," she said. She walked through the crowd with her chin up and her back straight, and every single guest stepped aside to let her pass, and not one of them said a word. I watched her go. Then I turned and looked at the stage where the string quartet sat with their instruments in their laps watching me. I walked toward it. The band leader saw me coming before I reached the first step of the stage. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a salt-and-pepper beard, and he read whatever was on my face clearly enough that he lowered his bow without being asked and held up one hand to stop the quartet mid-phrase. The music dissolved into the warm Napa air. 300 people registered the sudden quiet, the way you register a power outage, that half-second of collective confusion, before everyone looks around to understand what changed. I climbed the 3 steps to the stage. The band leader extended the microphone toward me without a word, and I took it. The feedback sang out sharp and brief across the vineyard. Every conversation died. I looked out at the crowd. 298 faces turned toward me. Some curious, some uneasy, some already pulling out their phones, which told me everything I needed to know about what kind of people my son had chosen to surround himself with. Edward Morgan stood near the front in his custom Navy suit champagne flute. Raised halfway to his lips, a slight frown creasing his forehead. He had the look of a man accustomed to controlling the temperature of every room he entered, and he did not appreciate that someone else had just changed it. I found Daniel in the crowd. He was still holding his champagne glass, his arm now loose at his side, the easy grin beginning to curdle at the edges as he registered what was happening. I kept my voice level, unhurried. The way you speak when you have decided exactly what you are going to say, and you are in no particular rush to be done with it. I want to thank everyone for being here today to celebrate Daniel and Chloe, I said. It means a great deal to have so many people witness the beginning of their life together. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly. He nudged Chloe, and she looked up from inspecting the hem of her gown. I had planned to present my wedding gift privately. I continued reaching into the breast pocket of my jacket. But given the events of the last few minutes, I think it's appropriate to do it here, in front of everyone. I held up the envelope. White, crisp, the Caldwell Bank seal visible on the back flap. Across the crowd, I watched people lean in, craning to see. Daniel straightened up, his chin lifted. The grin came back wider now, and he put his hand on the small of Chloe's back, with the particular satisfaction of a man who was about to receive something he felt he deserved. Statitium. This envelope contains a cashier's check for $150,000, I said. It was meant to be the down payment on the home Daniel and Chloe have been planning, a foundation for everything they said they wanted to build. Someone near the back started a premature smattering of applause. Edward lowered his champagne flute and allowed himself a small, approving nod. I said. The applause stopped. I opened the envelope. I pulled out the check, cream-colored, embossed the number printed in clean black ink. I held it up so the nearest Rose could see it clearly. Then I folded it once sharply along the center line, and I tore it in half. The sound of it carried. Clean and final, like a branch snapping, I tore it again. 4 pieces. I held them over the edge of the stage and opened my fingers. The pieces drifted down to the polished wooden floor in 4 separate arcs, unhurried, almost peaceful. Not a single person in that vineyard made a sound. My wife has loved that boy for 35 years, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, because the truth was that my chest was burning in a way I had not experienced since the morning my own father died. She drove 3,000 miles to bring him food at his own wedding, and he laughed while she was lying in the mud. I set the microphone back in the stand. I descended the 3 steps from the stage. The crowd parted for me the way crowds part for something they don't quite know how to respond to, quietly, carefully, eyes averted. I was 4 steps from the edge of the patio when I heard the feedback squeal again. I stopped walking, but did not turn around. Daniel's voice came through the speakers, amplified and tight with fury. "Keep your money, old man!" I turned then. He was on the stage, one hand gripping the microphone stand. His face flushed the deep red of someone who has just been publicly embarrassed and is responding to it the only way he knows how, by doubling down. "You think I need your penny-pinching savings?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word, which I suspected he did not intend. "Edward is making me a full partner in Morgan Coastal on Monday. A full partner. So take your little envelope pieces and go back to your workshop and your sawdust, because we are done here." There was a smattering of applause from Edward's side of the crowd. Uncomfortable. Obligatory. The kind of applause that fills a silence because the alternative is worse. Daniel wrapped his arm around Chloe's waist and pulled her against his side, and she laughed a bright, performative laugh that bounced off the stone walls of the estate and came back sounding hollow. I looked at my son standing on that stage, the boy who used to fall asleep on the drive home from Little League, who cried for an hour when our old retriever died, who once spent an entire Saturday helping me sand down a mahogany dresser because he wanted to learn how it was done. I looked at that boy, and I could not find him anywhere in the man at the microphone. I walked away. The parking lot was quiet and warm, the distant sounds of the reception already resuming behind me. Voices finding their register, again glass clinking, someone restarting a conversation that the interruption had cut short. Martha was sitting in the passenger seat of our rental car, with my suit jacket folded across her lap. She had wiped most of the mud from her hands, but a faint streak of it still ran along her forearm, just below the cuff of her ruined silver sleeve. I got in. I started the engine. She looked at me. Her eyes were dry now, but red at the corners, and there was a tightness around her jaw that told me she had been holding something together with considerable effort while she waited. "Are you okay?" she asked. "No," I said. "Are you—" Her chin trembled once, briefly. Then she pressed her lips together and looked straight ahead through the windshield at the long vineyard road. "He didn't even come to check on me, Leonard." "I know. Not once." Her voice cracked on the second word, splitting open just enough to let the grief through. 35 years I made that boy breakfast. 35 years. And he stood there and laughed. I put the car in drive. My hands were steady on the wheel, my chest was not. He said I was a full partner. I said quietly, more to myself than to her. "Edward's making him a full partner Monday." Martha looked at me. Is that good?" I thought about Edward Morgan's smile, the custom suit, the way he had nodded at my envelope like he was grading it, the absolute unearned confidence of a man who operated as though the rules that applied to everyone else had simply not been extended to him. "I don't know yet," I said. But something in the back of my mind had already started turning slow and quiet and very, very cold. We landed in Savannah just after 11 that night. The city was quiet. The way Savannah gets quiet in summer. Not empty, just slow, the heat still radiating up from the cobblestones even after dark. The Spanish moss hanging perfectly still in the windless air. I drove us home with the windows down because Martha said she needed the air, and I did not argue. She had not said much on either flight. She had held my hand through the turbulence over Nevada and looked out the window the rest of the time, and I had not pushed her to talk because some things need to be carried in silence before they can be set down properly. I got her inside. I made her tea she did not drink. I sat with her until her eyes started closing, and then I helped her to bed, pulling the cotton quilt up around her shoulders, the way she always did for me when I was sick. She caught my wrist as I stood to leave. "Leonard." Her voice was rough and tired. "Don't stay up too late." "I won't." She looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she knew I was lying, but had decided not to call it out. "The workshop will still be there in the morning." "I know it will." "Leonard." "Sleep, Maggie." She released my wrist. I listened until her breathing evened out, and then I walked down the hall through the kitchen and out the side door into the Georgia night. The Hayes Restoration Workshop sat 30 feet from the main house, a converted carriage house that I had spent the better part of 1987 rebuilding with my own hands. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the letters worn soft by 30 years of weather. Inside it smelled the way it always smelled, linseed oil and beeswax, and the particular sweetness of old wood giving up its secrets under patient hands. I had restored furniture in this building that was older than the state of Georgia. I had taught Daniel to sand with the grain in this building when he was 9 years old. I was not going to the workshop to work. I crossed the main floor without turning on the overhead lights, navigating by memory, past the long work tables and the half-finished secretary desk that had been waiting on me for 3 weeks. At the back wall behind the tall shelving unit was the door to the basement stairs. It had a keypad lock, 8 digits, a sequence I had chosen the year Martha's mother passed, and left us the first truly significant piece in the collection. I entered the code. The lock released with a soft click. The staircase was narrow. I took each step carefully in the dark, one hand on the wall, before I found the pull cord at the bottom and flooded the space with yellow light. The basement of the Hayes workshop was not large. 12 feet by 18, climate-controlled, lined on 3 walls with deep steel shelving units fitted with individual locked compartments. Each compartment had its own key, its own velvet-lined interior, its own documentation folder clipped to the inside of the door. I had spent 20 years assembling this collection, not as an investment portfolio, though it had become one, but because these objects were the closest thing to stop time I had ever found. A pocket watch that Theodore Roosevelt carried through the Panama Canal negotiations. A cavalry saber from the Gettysburg Campaign. A letter written in 1887 by Frederick Douglass to a schoolteacher in Baltimore. Things that had touched history and survived it. I walked to the 3rd unit on the left wall. The one Daniel had always been drawn to as a boy, the one I had made the mistake of showing him when he was 12, because he had asked what was in it, and I had wanted him to understand that some things were worth more than their price. The compartment door was closed. The small key lock showed no signs of damage. I pulled out my keys and opened it. My hand gripped the steel edge of the shelf so hard the metal bit into my palm. The Roosevelt watch was gone. The velvet impression of it remained a slight oval depression in the midnight blue lining, but the watch itself had been removed cleanly without disturbance by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. I moved to the next compartment. The cavalry saber gone. The display mount still in place, the small brass nameplate still reading 1863 Georgia Volunteer Infantry, but the blade itself lifted away as neatly as if it had never been there. I checked 7 compartments in total. 7 were empty. I sat down on the concrete floor with my back against the cold steel shelving unit, and I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until I saw white. The Roosevelt watch alone was insured for $2.4 million. The Douglas letter for $1.8. The complete collection of missing pieces, I ran the numbers, without wanting to, totaled somewhere north of $12 million. $12 million. But the number was not what made my chest feel like it was caving in. What made my chest cave in was the keypad code. 8 digits that no one in the world knew except me, and because I had taught him to love this room when he was a boy who asked good questions, my son. Daniel had not broken in. He had walked in. He had punched in the code I gave him when he was 12 years old, and trusted him with, and he had taken these things not in a rage or a moment of desperation, but deliberately, carefully, without leaving a mark. I thought about the timing. The wedding had been in Napa Valley. The items were gone, which meant Daniel had come here before the wedding. He had driven to Savannah, come into my workshop while we were away preparing to travel, and emptied 7 compartments with a code his father had trusted him with 23 years ago. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were not shaking, which surprised me. I felt as though they should be. I scrolled to a name I had not dialed in 4 months. Gerald Fitch, my attorney, the man who had structured every trust and every holding and every legal instrument in my professional life for the past 2 decades. It was nearly midnight. Gerald answered on the second ring, which told me he had seen my name and known this was not a social call. Leonard. His voice was alert immediately. What happened? I need you to wake up whoever handles your insurance recovery work, I said. And I need you to pull the Hartwell Fine Art insurance file. All of it. A pause. I heard Gerald sit up in bed, the rustle of sheets, the click of a lamp. Leonard, it's midnight. Talk to me. What am I looking at? 7 pieces, I said. From the basement. All registered. All chipped. I stopped, pressed my back harder against the cold steel. Daniel took them, Gerald. He took them before the wedding, and I need to know where they are right now. The silence on Gerald's end lasted exactly 3 seconds. I'll make the calls, he said. Stay by your phone. I ended the call and sat there on the concrete floor of my basement, with the yellow light humming above me, and 7 empty velvet compartments staring back at me, and the knowledge settling into my bones like cold water that the boy I had shown this room to the boy I had trusted with the code, with the history, with the idea that some things are worth protecting, had decided that none of it was worth as much as impressing his father-in-law. I was still on the basement floor when my phone rang. The clock on the screen read 2:17 in the morning. Gerald's name lit up the display, and I answered before the second vibration had finished. Talk to me, I said. I've got Sandra Cole on a 3-way. Gerald's voice had the careful, measured quality it took on when he was delivering information he knew was going to land hard. She's the recovery director at Hartwell. She pulled the file the moment I called. Leonard, the chips are active, all 7. Sandra Cole came on the line immediately, her voice crisp and professional, in the way of someone accustomed to being woken in the middle of the night for exactly this kind of situation. Mr. Hayes, I'm looking at the GPS data right now. All 7 registered items are currently showing the same location, a residential address in the Yountville area of Napa Valley. I pressed my free hand flat against the cold concrete floor. That's where the wedding reception was held. Yes. Based on the timestamps, the items arrived at that location approximately 18 hours ago. They haven't moved since. A brief pause as she pulled up additional data. However, I'm also seeing a secondary alert that came through at 9:47 this evening, after the items were already at the Yountville address. Someone accessed the Hartwell registration portal and ran a valuation inquiry on 3 of the 7 pieces. Gerald cut in. Which pieces? Shakitakin. The Roosevelt watch, the Douglas letter, and the Gettysburg saber, Sandra said. The inquiry was run through a third-party appraisal service called Pacific Coast Valuation Group. They're licensed but not certified for national heritage items. They wouldn't have the access codes to flag the Hartwell registration during a standard assessment. I closed my eyes. Which means whoever ran the appraisal didn't know the pieces were registered. Correct, Sandra said. A certified appraiser would have run a provenance check through the National Art Registry within the first 10 minutes. They would have found the Hartwell registration, seen the chip documentation, and stopped the process immediately. Pacific Coast Valuation didn't do that, either through negligence or deliberate avoidance, or because they were hired specifically to give a fast answer without asking inconvenient questions, Gerald said. That's also possible, Sandra agreed. Mr. Hayes, I want to make sure you understand what I'm describing technically when I say these items are chipped. As part of your 2022 registration agreement with Hartwell, each piece in the insured collection had a micro GPS transmitter embedded during the certification process. These are passive devices smaller than a grain of rice, typically embedded in a non-visible location on the piece itself. The Roosevelt watch has one inside the crown mechanism. The Sabre has one in the hilt. They transmit location data continuously through cellular networks to our monitoring system. We receive position updates every 4 hours under standard protocol, but the system escalates to real-time tracking the moment a piece is moved outside its registered storage location. So you've known they were gone since last night, I said. We received the initial movement alert at 6:14 yesterday evening, Sandra said. Standard protocol for a first-time movement alert is to wait 24 hours and attempt contact with the registered owner before escalating. Gerald's call tonight accelerated that timeline considerably. Gerald spoke carefully. Leonard, here's where this gets complicated from a legal standpoint. If these items were transported from Georgia to California, we're looking at interstate transportation of stolen property. That's a federal offense under Title 18 United States Code. Section 2314, not a state-level theft charge. The moment those pieces crossed state lines, this became an FBI matter. I got up off the floor. My knees ached from the concrete. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and stood there with one hand on the wooden railing, looking up at the dark rectangle of the doorway. What about the person who received them, the one who ordered the appraisal? Sandra answered. Under Title 18, Section 2315, receiving stolen property that has been transported across state lines is also a federal offense. Intent is a factor, but it is not an absolute defense. If we can demonstrate that a reasonable person in that position should have known the items were stolen, which a proper provenance check would have revealed, intent becomes significantly less relevant. Edward Morgan, I said. It was not a question. Gerald exhaled slowly. If Edward Morgan is the one who ordered that appraisal, then yes. He received $12 million in stolen cultural property and immediately had it valued through a non-certified service. That is not the behavior of an innocent man, Leonard. That is the behavior of a man who wanted a number without a paper trail. I thought about Edward at the reception. The Navy suit. The proprietary nod when I held up the envelope. The way he stood slightly in front of the crowd, as though the event had been staged for his review. He's going to try to use them as collateral, I said. That's what the appraisal is for. He needs the numbers to take to a bank. Sandra's voice sharpened. If he attempts to use registered stolen property as loan collateral, that adds bank fraud to the federal charges. Mr. Hayes, I need to ask you directly. Do you want Hartwell to activate the full recovery protocol? I looked at the 7 empty compartments from across the basement. The velvet impressions. The small brass nameplates. The documentation folders still clipped neatly to the inside of each door, as though the objects might come back on their own if the paperwork was still in order. Yes, I said. Chatiku. Then we'll file the formal stolen property report with the FBI art crime team first thing tomorrow morning, Sandra said. Once that report is filed, any financial institution that receives an application using these items as collateral is legally required to flag it and freeze the transaction pending investigation. Edward Morgan will not be able to use a single one of these pieces to secure a single dollar. He doesn't know that yet. Gerald said quietly. No, I said. He doesn't. Gerald paused. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped a register. Leonard, Daniel's name is going to be on this. As the person who removed the items and transported them across state lines, he's the primary. Whatever happens to Edward, Daniel is the one who took them. The staircase was very quiet. Somewhere above me in the house, I could hear the old ceiling fan turning in the bedroom where Martha was sleeping. I know, I said. Are you sure you want to proceed? I thought about Martha's voice in the car on the way to the airport. He didn't even come to check on me, Leonard. Not once. 35 years I made that boy breakfast. Start the process, I said. All of it. I ended the call and stood at the bottom of my basement stairs for a long time, my hand on the railing, staring at nothing in particular. My chest hurt in the deep structural way of something that has been under pressure for too long. Not rage, not grief exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than either. I climbed the stairs. I locked the basement door behind me. I walked back through the dark workshop past the unfinished secretary desk, past the work tables and the shelving and the hand-painted sign above the door, and I went back inside the house. I did not sleep that night. I made the coffee strong in the old ceramic pot Martha's sister had given us for our 20th anniversary. The one with the small chip on the handle neither of us had ever gotten around to fixing. I set 2 mugs on the kitchen table and watched the early light come through the window over the sink, turning the Savannah backyard from gray to gold, 1 slow degree at a time. I heard her before I saw her. The particular sound of Martha's footsteps in the hallway, unhurried, slightly shuffling. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her cotton robe, silver hair, loose eyes red at the corners, in the way that meant she had either cried in the night or lain awake trying not to. She looked at the 2 mugs. Then she looked at me. You didn't sleep, she said. Sit down, Maggie. She lowered herself into the chair across from mine and pulled the mug toward her, with both hands holding it without drinking steam rising between us. Outside, a mockingbird started up in the magnolia tree. How bad is it? She asked. 7 pieces from the basement, I said. All from the 3rd unit on the left wall. Her grip on the mug tightened. The Roosevelt watch. Yes. The saber. Yes. She set the mug down, knuckles going pale around it. Leonard, that collection is worth $12 million roughly. Hartwell confirmed overnight. Her breath left her in a long, unsteady rush. Her chin dropped for just a moment, and when she raised it, her eyes were bright with tears she was not ready to let fall. Daniel, she said. Not a question. Just his name landing in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. He knew the code since he was 12, I said. I showed him that room because I wanted him to understand what we were building. He must have come while we were traveling to California. Martha pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her shoulders trembled finely. Why didn't he just ask? Her voice cracked clean in half. If he needed money, if he was in trouble, why didn't he just come to us? Because he didn't think he needed to ask. He thought he was taking something that didn't matter to anyone. Thought I was just an old man with a basement full of dusty old things. Smart. The word came out flat and scorched. He laughed while I was lying in the mud at his wedding, and then he went home and stole from our basement, and you're telling me he thought that was smart. Her voice broke, and her shoulders gave out entirely great shuddering sobs she had clearly been holding back since the moment Chloe's hands hit her shoulders on that stone patio. I came around the table and put my hand on her back between her shoulder blades and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would make this smaller than it was. After a while, the sobs slowed. She pulled a paper towel from the counter and pressed it against her eyes. I kept thinking last night, she said, voice still rough. Maybe I did step on that dress on purpose without knowing it. Maybe there's something in me that wanted to ruin it. Maggie. My voice came out sharper than I intended. Stop. I'm serious, Leonard. Why else would she? Because she is the kind of person who pushes a 66-year-old woman into a flower bed and thinks that's an appropriate response to an accident. I crouched beside her chair so I was at eye level with her. You carried a tray of food to your son's wedding because you wanted to make sure he ate something on the happiest day of his life. There is nothing wrong with you. There has never been anything wrong with you. She looked at me, eyes swollen and absolutely direct. Then why did he laugh, Leonard? The question sat between us like something with weight and edges. I did not have an answer that would satisfy either of us. I don't know, I said honestly. But I'm going to find out. She straightened in her chair, and this time actually drank from her mug. I watched the trembling go out of her shoulders as the warmth hit. What happens now? She asked. With the pieces, with Daniel. Gerald and Hartwell are working on it. There's a tracking system on every item. We know where they are. And the police? Not yet. I went back to my seat. These pieces crossed state lines, which makes it federal, not state. Gerald's coordinating with the FBI art crime team. I want to know exactly what Daniel did with them before I decide how to move. Martha looked at me steadily over her mug. You're protecting him. I'm making sure I know what I'm doing before I do it. There's a difference. She considered that. Then very quietly, don't protect him at the expense of yourself, Leonard. Or me. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Gerald Sandra confirmed. Items now showing movement toward Financial District San Francisco. Coastal First Bank branch nearby. Meeting likely scheduled for business hours Monday. I turned the phone so Martha could read it. She read it twice. Then she looked out the window at the magnolia tree where the mockingbird was still going loud and entirely indifferent to the Hayes family's particular mourning. He gave them to Edward, she said. That's what it looks like. As a gift. Or as a down payment on something. Martha wrapped both hands around her mug again. Her jaw was set. Her eyes had gone from grief to something harder and quieter and considerably more dangerous. Then Edward Morgan is going to try to use our family's history to borrow money he doesn't have. Yes. She looked at me with the tone she used when a decision had been made and was final. What are you going to do about it? Martha pressed a thermos of coffee into my hands at the door that morning, without asking when I would be back. That was her way of telling me to handle it properly. Sandra Cole was already seated when Gerald's assistant showed me in. She was a trim woman in her mid-40s, with close-cropped dark hair and the unhurried, precise manner of someone who spent her professional life untangling other people's catastrophic mistakes. She stood and shook my hand with a firm, brief grip. Mr. Hayes, Sandra Cole, Recovery Director at Hartwell Fine Art Insurance. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. So am I said and sat down. Gerald closed the door and took his seat. Sandra flew in from the San Francisco office this morning. She's been tracking the items since the movement alert. Sandra turned her laptop toward me. On the screen was a map of the San Francisco Financial District, a blinking blue dot near the waterfront. All 7 items are in a secured private storage facility, a bonded art storage company called Pacific Vault, commonly used by Coastal First Bank as a third-party holding facility for collateral assets during loan origination. The fact that the items went there directly tells us Edward Morgan has already had a preliminary conversation with the bank. He moved them out of the Yuntville house, I said. Yesterday afternoon. He's been instructed on their collateral submission procedure and is moving quickly. Gerald leaned forward. Here's how this works. When someone wants to use fine art as collateral for a commercial loan, the bank requires the items to be placed in a bonded facility, appraised by a certified professional, and the provenance, the documented ownership history, must be verified before the application proceeds to underwriting. The provenance verification is where this falls apart for Edward, Sandra said. She placed a document in front of me. Pacific Coast Valuation Group completed their appraisal 48 hours ago. They assigned values consistent with the genuine market worth the Roosevelt watch alone at $2.3 million, but they did not run a National Art Registry provenance check. Why not? I asked. If it's required, Tace. It's required by certified appraisers under the American Society of Appraisers Code of Professional Standards, Sandra said. Pacific Coast Valuation is licensed at the state level in California, but does not hold national certification. A certified appraiser would have found your Hartwell registration in under 10 minutes. The moment they input the serial number or physical description, the system returns the registration ownership documentation and chip implantation records. The appraisal stops, and we are notified automatically. When is the bank meeting? I asked. Monday morning, June 23rd, 9 o'clock. The loan officer conducts a final review, then the application goes to underwriting. If approved, funds are wired within 48 hours. So we have a week, I said. Less if we want to move before underwriting. Sandra closed the laptop. When Hartwell files the formal stolen property notice with the FBI Art Crime Team, the Bank Secrecy Act, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network require any financial institution receiving that notice to freeze the transaction immediately and report to federal authorities. Coastal First Bank will have no choice. The moment our notice hits their compliance department, the application is dead. And Edward say, I asked. Gerald answered. Under Title 18, Section 2315, receiving stolen property across state lines is a federal felony regardless of whether the recipient knew the property was stolen, provided a reasonable person in that position should have known. Edward accepted $12 million in cultural artifacts as a wedding gift from his son-in-law and immediately moved them into a bank's collateral process without running a basic provenance check. He paused. A man with 20 years in hospitality business knows how asset verification works. The argument that he had no reason to be suspicious is going to be very difficult to make. Sandra looked at me steadily. What I need today is your formal authorization for Hartwell to file the FBI notice and initiate the full recovery protocol. Once I have that signature, the process moves on our timeline, not Edward Morgan's. I thought about what Martha had said that morning. Don't protect him at the expense of yourself. Or me. I picked up the pen Gerald was already holding out. One question first, I said. Does Daniel know Edward took the pieces to a bank? Gerald answered carefully. Our assessment is that Daniel handed them over as a wedding gift and was not informed of what Edward intended. Whether that changes his legal exposure is for the federal prosecutor to determine. But right now, the person actively committing a federal offense is Edward Morgan. I signed the authorization form, then the FBI referral document. I set the pen down and looked out the 14th floor window at the Atlanta skyline, gray and bright and indifferent. Does Edward know who owns the collection? I asked. Sandra shook her head. He has no reason to connect the items to you. As far as Edward Morgan is concerned, he received a gift from his son-in-law and is converting an asset into working capital. Good, I said. I want it to stay that way. For now. Gerald looked at me with the expression he reserved for moments when he suspected I was thinking several moves ahead. Leonard, what are you planning? I stood up and buttoned my jacket. I'm planning to let Edward Morgan walk all the way into that bank on Monday morning, thinking he's holding $12 million in legitimate collateral. I picked up my thermos. And then I'm planning to watch everything he thinks he has disappear in about 15 minutes. Sandra looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at me. I'll have the FBI notice ready to file Sunday night, Sandra said. First thing Monday morning, it goes to Coastal First Bank's compliance department. Perfect, I said, right before the 9 o'clock meeting. The drive back from Atlanta took just under 4 hours, and I spent most of it with the radio off. There are conversations that settle into your bones during long drives. Not the ones you had, but the ones you are still turning over, testing from different angles. Looking for the place where you could have said something differently and arrived somewhere better. I had signed 2 federal authorization forms that afternoon. I had set a legal mechanism in motion that could not be recalled once it reached Coastal First Bank's compliance department on Monday morning. Gerald had walked me to the elevator afterward and said quietly that I should be prepared for this to move faster than I expected once the FBI was formally involved. I told him I was prepared. I was not entirely sure that was true. Martha had left a plate of food covered in foil on the kitchen counter, with a note that said, "Eat something" underneath it in her handwriting. I ate standing at the counter, tasting nothing in particular, looking out the window at the dark shape of the workshop across the yard. When I was done, I washed the plate and set it in the rack and walked outside. The workshop at night had its own particular quality of quiet. The smell hit me first: linseed oil and old wood, and the faint mineral sharpness of the steel tools hanging on the pegboard above the main bench. I pulled the cord on the work light over the center table, and the warm yellow circle of it fell across the half-finished secretary desk that had been waiting on me for 3 weeks. Cherry wood circa 1840 with a broken fall front hinge that needed to be sourced from a specialty supplier in Vermont. Patient work. The kind of work that did not ask anything of you except your full attention. I sat down on the stool. I did not pick up any tools. I just sat in the yellow light and looked at the desk and thought about the last time Daniel had sat in this workshop with me. He had been 9 years old. I had given him a piece of walnut scrap and a sheet of medium grit sandpaper and told him to sand with the grain, not against it. He had lasted about 8 minutes before he started sanding in circles, and when I corrected him, he had looked up at me with that particular expression children wear when they are certain the adult is being unnecessarily complicated about something simple. "Dad," he had said with tremendous 9-year-old authority, "does it actually matter?" "It matters," I had told him. "The grain is the structure of the thing. You work against it, you tear it apart. You work with it, you bring out what's already there." He had looked at the scrap of walnut for a moment, considering this with the seriousness he occasionally applied to things when he thought I was not watching him do it. Then he had gone back to sanding. With the grain that time. I did not know when the boy who sanded with the grain had become the man who punched a code into his father's basement lock and walked out with $12 million in cultural history under his arm. I did not know at what precise point the line had been crossed. People who study these things, psychologists, criminologists, will tell you, there is rarely a single moment. There is usually a long, slow accumulation of small permissions, each one granted so quietly that the person granting them barely notices. I had given Daniel every material advantage and very little resistance. I had meant it as preparation. I was beginning to understand it had been something else entirely. My phone rang. The screen read, "Daniel." I looked at it for 2 full rings before I answered. "Hey, Dad." His voice was casual in the practiced way of someone working hard to sound casual. I figured I'd check in. "That's considerate of you," I said. A brief pause. Look, I know things got a little heated at the reception. I want you to know I'm not holding any of that against you. The sheer architecture of that sentence, the way it positioned him as the aggrieved party generously choosing not to retaliate, was almost impressive. I kept my voice even. How is Chloe? She's great. We had a fantastic few days up here. The valley is beautiful this time of year. Another pause, slightly less smooth than the first. Edward mentioned there might be some kind of administrative issue with the appraisal on a few of the pieces. Something about a certification question. Did you have anything to do with that? There it was. Edward had already felt the first tremor and gone straight to Daniel. What pieces would those be? I asked. Dad. His voice tightened slightly. You know what pieces? Tell me, Daniel. A long exhale. The things I brought to the wedding, for Edward. I thought they were just sitting down there. You never talked about them. I didn't think it was a big deal. $12 million, I said. You didn't think $12 million was a big deal. The silence on his end lasted exactly 4 seconds. When he came back, his voice had shifted, less casual, more pressured, the way a man sounds when he is recalculating his position in real time. I didn't know they were worth that. I thought they were just old things. Collector stuff. I was trying to make a good impression on Edward's family. I was trying to show them that I came from people with history, with substance. You came from people with history, I said. You chose to take that history without asking and hand it to a man you've known for 18 months. Dad, Did you ask your mother if she was all right after the reception? The question landed differently than he expected. I heard it in the half-second delay before he answered. She's fine. It was mud, not, She cried for an hour in our kitchen this morning, Daniel. She sat at the table where you ate breakfast for 18 years and asked me why you laughed. His breath caught. Just barely. Just enough. I didn't mean for it to go like that. What did you mean for it to go like? He did not answer that. Instead, Dad, is there a way to straighten out the appraisal issue? If it's a certification problem, I can have Edward's people get a different firm. It doesn't have to become a whole thing. I looked at the half-finished secretary desk in the yellow work light. The broken hinge. The cherry wood grain running in clean, patient lines from one end of the fall front to the other. Get some rest, Daniel, I said. Enjoy the rest of your time in Napa. Dad. Good night, son. I ended the call. I sat for a long time in the workshop after that, just me and the smell of old wood and the unfinished desk and the 9-year-old boy I could still see very clearly in my memory, sanding with the grain because his father told him it mattered. Outside, the Georgia night was warm and completely still. The week between Atlanta and Monday passed. The way weeks pass when you are waiting for something irreversible, slowly at first, then all at once. Martha and I did not talk about Daniel every day. We talked about the secretary desk and the specialty hinge supplier in Vermont, who had finally returned my call about the neighbor's new dog that kept getting into our azaleas, about whether the ceiling fan in the bedroom needed replacing or just a good cleaning. We talked about everything except the thing that sat between us like a stone in still water, and somehow that was the right thing to do. Some weights are best carried quietly until the moment you can set them down. Gerald called Thursday to confirm that Sandra had filed the formal stolen property notice with the FBI art crime team on Sunday evening, exactly as planned. The notice was time-stamped 11:47 p.m. Pacific Time. By federal protocol, Coastal First Bank's compliance department would receive the flagged documentation through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, no later than 8 a.m. Monday morning, a full hour before Edward Morgan's 9 o'clock appointment with the loan officer. I was in the kitchen at 6:30 Monday morning, coffee made, when Sandra called. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes." Her voice had the contained energy of someone who had been awake for hours and was running on competence and purpose. "I'm outside the Coastal First Branch on Montgomery Street. I want to walk you through this as it happens." "I'm listening," I said. "The FinCEN flag hit their system at 7:52 this morning. I have a contact in the bank's compliance office who confirmed receipt. The flag triggers an automatic hold on any pending transaction associated with the flagged collateral, in this case, all 7 items. The loan application is frozen. No funds can be moved, no documentation can proceed to underwriting, and the collateral itself is now legally encumbered pending the FBI investigation." I set my mug on the counter. "Does Edward know yet?" "Not as of 7 minutes ago. His appointment is still listed as active in the bank's system. The loan officer will have received an internal compliance alert on his workstation this morning. But bank protocol in these situations is to allow the meeting to proceed and present the situation to the applicant in person, accompanied by a compliance officer. They do not call ahead." "They let him walk in," I said. They let him walk in," Sandra confirmed. "It's standard procedure. It creates a controlled environment and ensures the applicant is informed of their legal obligations regarding the flagged assets in the presence of a bank official." I looked out the kitchen window at the workshop across the yard. The morning light was hitting the old carriage house doors at a low angle, turning the weathered wood a deep, warm amber. "What time is it there?" I asked. 6:41 a.m. Pacific. "He'll be arriving in approximately 2 hours and 19 minutes, assuming he's punctual." A brief pause. "I'll call you when he enters the building." I spent those 2 hours and 19 minutes finishing my coffee, reading the morning paper, without retaining much of it, and walking out to the workshop to spend some time with the secretary desk. I replaced the fall front hinge with the one that had arrived from Vermont on Friday. Patient, careful work, the kind that does not care what else is happening in the world. When my phone rang at 8:58 a.m., my hands were clean, and I was back in the kitchen. "He just walked in," Sandra said. "Edward Morgan, accompanied by his attorney and a personal assistant. He's wearing a gray suit. He looks confident." "I imagine he does," I said. 8 minutes passed. I could hear ambient street noise through Sandra's phone traffic, a distant siren, the particular urban texture of a San Francisco morning. Then Sandra's voice came back lower and more precise. The compliance officer just intercepted them before they reached the loan officer's desk. "They've been redirected to a private meeting room. I can see through the glass partition from here." A pause. "Edward just took the document the compliance officer handed him. He's reading it." Another pause. "His attorney is leaning over his shoulder." The attorney just stood up straight very quickly. "What does that look like?" I asked. "It looks," Sandra said carefully, "like a man who just discovered the floor is not where he thought it was." I heard it in her voice, not satisfaction exactly, but the particular quality of a person watching a complicated mechanism perform exactly as designed. "The compliance officer is explaining the FinCEN flag," Sandra continued. "Standard script, the collateral assets have been identified as subject to a federal stolen property investigation. The transaction is frozen pending resolution, and the bank is legally required to report the application to the FBI art crime team and preserve all documentation." A brief silence. "Edward is on his feet now. He's pointing at the document. His face is, he's not taking this calmly. Is he making a scene? He's raising his voice enough that I can see other customers near the entrance, looking toward the back of the bank." Sandra's tone remained level. "His attorney has a hand on his arm. The compliance officer has not changed expression. These people are very well trained." I sat down at the kitchen table. Outside, the mockingbird was back in the magnolia tree running through its repertoire with the cheerful relentlessness of something that had no idea what morning it was. And Sandra, I said, thank you for all of it. Thank Gerald, she said. He gave us the timeline to move efficiently. We just followed the chips. A pause. Mr. Hayes, the FBI case agent assigned to the file, will want to make contact with you this week. I'll send you his information. There will be an interview process. They'll want your formal account of the theft, the timeline, the basement access. It's straightforward, given the documentation, but it will take some time. That's fine, I said. One more thing. Her voice dropped a register. Edward Morgan's attorney just handed him a phone. Based on the body language, I believe he's calling someone. A pause. Daniel, most likely. Or someone who will call Daniel. I thought about the 9-year-old with the sandpaper. I thought about the man on the phone 3 nights ago, breezy and calculating, asking if there was a way to straighten out the appraisal issue without it becoming a whole thing. It was going to become a whole thing. Let me know if anything changes, I said. I will. Sandra ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the magnolia tree and waited for my phone to ring again. I did not have to wait long. The phone rang at 9:14. Not Daniel. Edward. I looked at the number for one full ring, an unfamiliar California area code that Gerald had sent me in a text thread 2 days ago, along with the note Morgan's personal cell, in case he reaches out directly. I answered on the second ring. "Call Mr. Hayes." Edward's voice was controlled in the way of a man who had spent 20 years in boardrooms learning to keep his register steady regardless of what was happening underneath. But I could hear it, the faint tightness at the edges of his consonants, the slightly accelerated pace of a man whose morning had not gone the way he planned. "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Not at all," I said. "How was the wedding, Edward, that I don't believe we had a chance to speak properly before things concluded?" A beat of silence, the kind that meant he had not expected pleasantries and was recalibrating. "The wedding was wonderful, thank you. Listen, I'm calling because there seems to be an administrative complication with some items Daniel gave us as a gift. A banking matter. Completely routine, I'm sure, but I was hoping you might be able to help clarify the provenance situation." "What kind of clarification are you looking for?" I asked. "So the items appear to be registered under an insurance policy that lists a different owner. Our bank's compliance team flagged it this morning as a matter of routine." His voice was smooth and reasonable, the voice of a man accustomed to reframing problems as minor inconveniences. "If you could simply provide a letter confirming that Daniel had authorization to transfer the pieces, the whole matter resolves itself very quickly." I leaned back in my chair. "A letter confirming authorization. Exactly. 1 paragraph, really. Just confirming that the items were a gift freely given." "Edward," I said, keeping my voice entirely pleasant, "those pieces belong to a registered collection. The owner of that collection did not authorize any transfer." The smoothness went out of his voice. "I understand that. But surely as Daniel's father, you have some influence over how this—" "I'm afraid you've misunderstood my role here," I said. "I'm Daniel's father. The collection belongs to someone else entirely." A longer pause. When he came back, the boardroom voice was gone. What replaced it was rawer and considerably less polished. "Mr. Hayes, my loan application is frozen. I have 3 hotels that are cross-collateralized on this transaction. If this doesn't resolve by end of week, I'm looking at a default trigger on existing financing." "That does sound serious," I said. "It is serious." His voice cracked slightly on the second word. "I need you to help me reach whoever owns that collection. Today." Not through lawyers, not through insurance companies. Directly, person to person. I'll see what I can do, I said. In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest you speak with Daniel about exactly where those pieces came from and under what circumstances he acquired them. I ended the call before he could respond. 11 minutes later, Daniel called. He did not open with pleasantries this time. His voice came through the phone tight and high, stripped of every trace of the practiced casualness he had used 3 nights ago. "Dad, what is going on?" Edward just called me screaming. He said the bank froze everything. He said the pieces I gave him are flagged by the FBI. "Are you somewhere private?" I asked. "I'm in the hotel room. Chloe's in the shower." A breath. "Dad, I need you to tell me honestly, is this you? Did you do this? The collection is registered Daniel. Every piece has been registered with Hartwell Fine Art Insurance since 2022. Each one has a GPS chip embedded during the certification process. When those items were moved out of the state of Georgia, the monitoring system flagged them automatically." A sound came through the phone that I could not immediately classify, something between a gasp and a groan, the sound a person makes when the ground drops out from under them. "You chipped them." "The insurance company chipped them. Standard protocol for collections valued over $5 million. "Dad." His voice was shaking now, genuinely shaking, not the performed versions of distress he had offered in previous conversations. "I didn't know that. I swear I didn't know they were registered. I thought they were just... I thought you kept them because you liked old things. I didn't think anyone was tracking them." "Studio, what did you think would happen when Edward put them in front of a bank?" "I thought I don't know what I thought." His breathing was audible and unsteady. "I thought it would be fine. I thought they'd appraise them, use them for a couple months, and then I'd figure something out. I didn't think it would turn into a federal..." He stopped himself. "Is this federal? Is the FBI actually involved?" "The FBI art crime team opened a case file based on the Hartwell notice," I said. "Interstate transportation of registered stolen property is a federal matter, Daniel. That's not something I created. That's the law." The sound he made then was not a word. It was something smaller and more broken than a word, the kind of sound that comes out of a person when they finally understand the full weight of what they have done and find it considerably heavier than they expected. "Hi, Dad." His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "What do I do?" I looked out the kitchen window at the workshop. The morning sun had moved off the carriage house doors. The amber was gone. Just weathered wood, now patient and gray. "Talk to a lawyer, Daniel," I said. "A good one. Today." I ended the call. My hands were steady. My chest was not. I was not in that hotel room in Napa Valley when everything between Daniel and Chloe collapsed. What I know about that afternoon came later in pieces, some from Daniel himself, some from Gerald's investigator, and one crucial detail from a source I did not expect. But I have assembled it carefully enough that I believe I know how it went. Chloe came out of the bathroom to find her husband of 9 days sitting on the edge of the bed with his phone in both hands, and the particular expression of a man who has just realized the story he has been telling himself does not match the facts on the ground. She was in a hotel robe, her hair damp, and she looked at him the way she had learned to look at people who were about to disappoint her, with a preemptive narrowing of the eyes that said she had already begun preparing for whatever was coming. "What happened?" she said. "Nothing," Daniel said. "Edward's dealing with a bank thing." "Daniel." Her voice sharpened immediately. "I heard you on the phone. You said FBI." He opened his mouth, closed it, set the phone down on the bedspread between them like an object he no longer wanted to be holding. It's complicated. Then uncomplicate it for me. She sat down on the chair across from him, crossed her arms, and waited. What he told her, she later told her father, was a version, a carefully edited version, that positioned him as someone who had made a well-intentioned mistake, rather than someone who had walked into his parents' basement with a 6-digit code and walked out with $12 million in federal property. He said he had borrowed some items from his father's collection. He said he had planned to return them. He said the registration situation was something his father's insurance company had complicated unnecessarily. Chloe listened to all of it. Then her phone rang. It was Edward. She answered it in front of Daniel, and what came through the speaker was not the measured, authoritative voice of the man who had hosted 300 people in a Napa Valley vineyard 9 days ago. It was the voice of a man standing on the sidewalk outside a San Francisco bank with his attorney and a frozen loan application, and 20 years of leveraged real estate suddenly trembling on their foundations. "Ah, Chloe," he said, and the single word carried everything. "Those things Daniel gave me, the watch, the letter, the saber. Did he tell you where he got them?" She looked at Daniel. "He said they were family heirlooms." "They are family heirlooms," Edward said. "His father's family heirlooms, registered with a federal insurance program and equipped with GPS tracking since 2022. Every single one of them. Daniel walked into his father's collection, took $12 million in registered artifacts, and handed them to me as a wedding gift, without telling either of us where they actually came from." The sound Chloe made was not quite a word. Daniel reached toward her arm, and she pulled it back so sharply she knocked the lamp on the nightstand, catching it before it fell. "My hotels are cross-collateralized on this transaction." Edward continued, his voice cracking down the middle. "If the FBI investigation proceeds and I cannot demonstrate I received these items in good faith, I am looking at federal charges. Criminal charges, Chloe. Because your husband decided to steal from his own parents to impress me." She ended the call. The room was very still for a moment, the kind of still that comes right before something breaks. Then Chloe stood up and looked at her husband of 9 days and said in a voice so controlled it was almost frightening, "You stole from your own parents. Chloe, well, you laughed when your mother was lying in a flower bed covered in mud." Her voice rose on the last word, cracking open into something raw and shaking. "I pushed her. I put my hands on a 66-year-old woman and shoved her off a patio, and you stood there and laughed and said she always ruins everything, and then you went home and stole from her basement. I didn't steal from her specifically, Stop." She held up her hand, and it was trembling fingers spread like she was physically pushing his words back. "Do not tell me you didn't steal from her. Do not stand in front of me and explain the legal distinction between stealing from your father and stealing from your mother when they share the same house and the same basement and the same 30 years of their lives." Daniel was on his feet now. His face flushed, his voice fraying badly at the edges. "I was trying to give us a real start. Edward needed the backing, we needed the partnership. The word came out of her like a stone thrown hard. "You made a decision that involved federal property, my father's business, my family's financial stability, and my name, and you did it without telling me a single word. That's not we, that's you. Alone. Making choices that destroyed everything around you and calling it a partnership." Her voice broke on the last word, and then the tears came, not soft. Tears, not the kind that run quietly, but the kind that shake a person's shoulders and come with sounds that cannot be contained. She sat back down in the chair and pressed both hands over her face and cried with the kind of grief that is not entirely about the present moment, the kind that has been accumulating in layers for longer than 9 days. Daniel stood in the center of the hotel room and did not move toward her. He just stood there, his hands at his sides, his face doing something complicated that was not quite remorse and not quite defiance, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. "My father could go to prison," Chloe said, her voice muffled behind her hands. "Because you thought a pocket watch was a good way to make him like you." Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed. He put his face in his hands. He did not cry. He just sat there with the weight of it, and in that moment, by all accounts, he looked very much like a man who had run an enormous distance and just realized he had been running in the wrong direction the entire time. His phone buzzed on the bedspread. A text from Edward: "Get a lawyer. Do not speak to anyone about the items. Do not call your father." Daniel looked at the message for a long time. Then he called me anyway. Daniel called at 2:17 in the afternoon. I was in the workshop not working, just sitting on the stool, with my hands resting on the edge of the work table, looking at the secretary desk that I had finally finished that morning. The fall front hinge was seated perfectly. The cherrywood grain ran clean and uninterrupted from one end to the other. I had spent 31 years learning how to fix broken things, and I had done it again, and it gave me no particular satisfaction on this particular afternoon. I answered on the first ring. Dad." His voice was different from this morning. The shaking was gone, replaced by something flatter and more exhausted, the voice of a man who had been crying or arguing or both for several hours, and had come out the other side into a gray, depleted place. "Edward's hotels are going under." "Tell me what you know," I said. "His attorney called my attorney an hour ago." A pause. "I have an attorney now, apparently. He's a friend of a friend. He does criminal defense, and he told me not to call you, and I called you anyway, because I don't actually know what else to do." His breath was audible and unsteady. "The bank sent Edward a formal default notice this afternoon. Because the loan application collapsed the one with your pieces as collateral, the bank triggered what his attorney called an acceleration clause on his existing property loans." "One, explain that," I said, though I already knew. "Edward used his 3 hotels as cross-collateral to back the new loan. Cross-collateral means the same assets are securing multiple loans simultaneously. When the new loan defaulted, because the collateral was flagged as stolen property, the bank treated it as a breach of the cross-collateral agreement. That breach gave them the right to accelerate the existing loans, meaning they can demand full repayment immediately, instead of waiting for the scheduled payment dates." He stopped. "His attorney says he cannot produce the capital to satisfy the acceleration demand. The bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings on all 3 properties." "That is what an acceleration clause does," I said. "Dad." The flat exhaustion cracked slightly. "Those are real hotels. There are employees. There are people whose paychecks depend on those properties staying operational." "I know that. Is there anything you can do to slow it down, or I don't know?" "Something." I stood up from the stool and walked to the workshop door, looking out at the late afternoon light on the Savannah Street. 2 neighbors were walking a dog. A kid was riding a bicycle with absolute confidence and no helmet. The ordinary world entirely indifferent. "Daniel, I want you to listen to me carefully," I said. "The acceleration clause is a contractual mechanism between Edward and his bank. I did not write that contract. I did not create those terms. Edward borrowed against assets he did not fully own and cross-collateralized properties he was already overextended on. When the collateral was identified as stolen, the bank enforced the contract they had with him. That is not something I can or should reverse. But you own part of his company." His voice sharpened suddenly, a flash of the old certainty cutting through the exhaustion. "Hartwell told their investigator that the owner of the collection holds a significant stake in Morgan Coastal Hotels. That's you, isn't it? 48%. If you wanted to intervene with the bank. I did not confirm it. Not yet. Where did you hear that? Gerald's investigator ran the holding structure. It came up in the documentation. A pause longer this time. Dad, you've owned nearly half of Edward's company for 11 years. He never knew. That is a separate matter, I said. Is it? His voice was quiet now, not combative, genuinely asking. Because from where I'm standing, you have known for years exactly what kind of businessman Edward Morgan was. You watched him build something on borrowed money and borrowed credibility, and you let it happen. I invested in a hospitality company with sound fundamentals 11 years ago, I said. The decisions Edward made with his own majority share are his own. I am not his guardian. Oh, but you're going to let the hotels fail. I'm going to let the consequences of a series of decisions play out without interfering, I said. That is not the same thing. The line was quiet for a moment, not silence but the absence of argument, which was different. Then, Chloe's not speaking to me. I imagine she's not. She called her father after I spoke with you this morning. He told her everything. She packed a bag an hour ago, and she's in a different room. His voice dropped to something very low. She said she's filing for separation when we get back to Georgia. We've been married 11 days, Dad. I closed my eyes for a moment. The light behind my eyelids was orange from the afternoon sun. I thought about the woman who had pushed my wife off a stone patio 9 days ago. I thought about the arrogant brightness of her laugh and the proprietary way she had straightened Daniel's collar at the reception. I thought about her crying in that hotel room, genuinely crying in a way that was not performed for anyone's benefit. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it for more than one reason. Your attorney is going to receive a formal request from the FBI case agent this week, I told him. Cooperate fully. Tell the truth about the timeline, the basement, all of it. The documentation is thorough enough that the truth is your only real option. And if I cooperate fully, does that help with the charges? That is a conversation for your attorney, I said. Not me. Gerald called 20 minutes after I ended the call with Daniel. His voice had the careful, measured quality it reserved for significant developments. Leonard, the FBI case agent has formally requested a meeting with you for Thursday. They want your victim statement and the full timeline. It's routine at this stage, but it matters. I'll be there, I said. There's something else. He paused. Edward's attorney reached out to my office this afternoon. Edward wants to meet with the owner of the collection directly. He still doesn't know it's you. He's offering to return all 7 pieces and sign a full liability waiver in exchange for a meeting. He thinks he can negotiate his way out. I looked at the finished secretary desk in the yellow work light, the cherry wood grain, the perfectly seated hinge. 31 years of learning that broken things fixed properly are stronger in the repaired places than they ever were before. Tell his attorney, I said, that the owner of the collection is willing to meet next week. Atlanta. He drove up from the airport on a Wednesday morning 2 days after our last phone call, and I heard his rental car in the driveway before I saw it. The particular sound of an unfamiliar engine pulling slowly to a stop, the way people drive when they are not sure of their welcome. I was at the main workbench when he knocked on the open workshop door. Not the house door, the workshop, which told me something about the state of his mind, that he had come here to this specific building rather than ringing the front doorbell and asking for his mother. Dad. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, no blazer, no tailored anything. His eyes were red at the edges, and his jaw carried the shadow of a man who had stopped paying attention to whether he had shaved. Can I come in? You know where the chairs are, I said. He sat in the old wooden chair in the corner, the one that had been in this workshop since before he was born, the one he used to tip back on 2 legs when he was 12, until I told him to stop before he broke his neck. He sat on it flat-footed now, elbows on his knees, hands loose between them. My attorney says I shouldn't be talking to you without him present, he said. Then why are you here? Because he's my attorney, and you're my father, and those are not the same thing. He looked around the workshop, the tools on the pegboard, the shelving units, the smell of linseed oil and old wood. I haven't been in here in a long time. He looked at the secretary desk on the center table. Is that finished? This morning, I said. He nodded slowly, looking at it with something that was not quite grief, but lived in the same neighborhood. I used to love watching you work, he said. You'd be at that bench for hours, and I'd just sit here. I thought you were the most patient person in the world. What do you think now? I asked. His eyes were very direct. I think I confused patience with passivity. I thought you didn't push back because you couldn't. I didn't understand it was because you were choosing not to. Edward's lawyers are trying to build a case that I acted alone, he said after a moment. That I deceived him, which is partly true. He didn't know they were registered, but he also didn't ask. He saw $12 million in antiques and moved immediately without running a single check. That is for the federal prosecutor to assess, I said. I know. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture I recognized from childhood, the one he made when a problem had grown bigger than his ability to manage it. Dad, did you know this would happen? When you registered the collection, put the chips in, were you waiting for me to do something like this? No, I said honestly. The registration was Sandra Cole's recommendation, standard practice for collections above a certain value. I did not anticipate you would take them. I turned a small cabinet pull over in my fingers. But I am not surprised that you did, and that is a harder thing to say. His chin dropped. His throat moved as he swallowed. You saw it coming, just not the specific shape of it. I saw that something had gone wrong. The day you stood on that stage after what happened to your mother and announced your partnership, that was the day I understood it was not fixable with a conversation. He was crying now. Not loudly, the quiet, shameful kind that a grown man produces when he has run out of other options. Tears moving down his face while his expression stayed mostly still. I laughed at her, he said. She was on the ground, and I laughed. Yes, I said. You did. I don't know why. I've been trying to figure it out for 11 days, and I cannot find the reason. It just came out. Like it was the easiest thing in the world. That was the part that hurt most. Not that he had done it, but that it had been easy. That was the distance between the boy who sanded with the grain and the man who had laughed. Is there anything I can do? He asked. To fix it, I walked to the old walnut cabinet in the corner and opened the lower drawer. Inside was a photograph Daniel at 9 years old sitting exactly where he was sitting now, a piece of walnut scrap in his hands, squinting at the grain with a seriousness he would have denied if you mentioned it. I had taken it with a disposable camera and never told him. I set it on the workbench between us. His jaw tightened. Fresh tears moved down his face without him wiping them. Some things, I said, you cannot fix. You can only build something new on what remains. I picked up my coffee mug. Your mother does not know you're here. He looked up sharply. Should I go see her? Not today. Today you go back to your attorney and tell him everything. The full truth, the date, the time, the code, all of it. Because the meeting I have scheduled in Atlanta next week is going to change the landscape considerably, and I want you to have told the truth before that happens. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, stood up slowly like a man whose joints were older than his years. He looked at the photograph. "Can I have that?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I will keep it." He stopped at the workshop door and looked back, not the flash of old certainty, not practiced casualness. Just a man in a gray t-shirt who looked very tired and very young and very lost. "What's happening in Atlanta?" he asked. "See, something that should have happened a long time ago," I said. "Go talk to your lawyer, Daniel." He left. I heard the rental car back out of the driveway and fade away into the ordinary Savannah morning. I stood in the workshop for a long time after that, looking at the photograph of the 9-year-old boy on the old wooden chair. Before I show you what happened when Edward saw who was sitting at the head of that table, leave the word justice in the comments. I'll know you made it this far. Quick note, some details ahead are fictional, crafted to carry something worth hearing. The names aren't real. But what this story is really saying, that part is. Martha ironed my suit jacket the morning of the Atlanta meeting. I did not ask her to. I came out of the bathroom to find her standing at the ironing board in the bedroom, running the iron slowly along the lapel of my charcoal jacket with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. Her lips pressed together in concentration. She had known about the meeting for a week. She had not asked me what I planned to say or do in that room. She had simply that morning gotten out the ironing board. When she finished, she held the jacket open for me. I slid my arms in. She smoothed the shoulders with both hands, then reached up and fastened the top button of my shirt with fingers that trembled very slightly, not from age, but from the particular tension of someone who has been holding something together for a long time and can feel the moment approaching when they will finally be allowed to set it down. "Come home in one piece," she said. "I'll be back by dinner," I told her. She looked at me for a moment, not the look she gave me when she knew I was lying, but a different one. Something quieter, something that had 41 years of mornings in it. "Whatever happens in that room," she said, "I want you to know that I am proud of you. Not for what you've built, for how you built it." I drove to Atlanta. Gerald's firm occupied the 14th floor of a glass building on Peachtree Street, and the conference room he had reserved for the meeting faced east, which meant the morning light came in hard and direct off the Atlanta skyline and fell across the long mahogany table in clean, unforgiving lines. I had arrived 40 minutes early. I sat at the head of the table because that was where the chair was placed for me, and I straightened my jacket, and I looked out at the city I had watched grow for 30 years, and I waited. Gerald sat to my right. Sandra Cole sat to his right, her laptop open, her folder on the table beside it, her expression professionally composed. 3 chairs had been arranged on the opposite side of the table for Edward, his attorney, and the loan officer from Coastal First Bank, who had agreed to attend as a neutral party representing the frozen collateral transaction. At 9 o'clock exactly, the door opened. Edward Morgan walked in first. He was wearing a charcoal suit that matched mine almost precisely in color, which I noticed and which I suspected he would notice later and find unpleasant. He had aged visibly in the 3 weeks since the wedding. The skin under his eyes was bruised with exhaustion, and his jaw carried the tight, compressed look of a man who had been clenching his teeth in his sleep. He walked with the posture of a man trying to project confidence he was no longer entirely certain he possessed. Behind him came his attorney, a tall, thin man in his 50s with silver hair and the watchful eyes of someone paid to notice everything before his client noticed anything. And behind the attorney came the Coastal First loan officer, a younger man in a blue suit, who carried a leather portfolio and looked like he would rather be almost anywhere else on earth. Edward scanned the room as he entered. His eyes moved across Gerald, across Sandra, across the legal documents arranged in front of them. His gaze landed on me last. He did not recognize me immediately. I watched the moment his eyes registered my face, a brief flicker of something, a slight hesitation in his step, the way a person pauses when they see someone familiar in an unfamiliar context and cannot immediately place them. He pulled out the chair directly across from me and sat down, and his attorney sat beside him, and the loan officer took the third chair. Thank you for arranging this," Edward said, addressing Gerald. His voice was smooth and controlled the boardroom register, the one I had heard him use at the wedding reception when he was telling an anecdote to his guests. "I think if we can speak directly with the collection owner, we can resolve this situation to everyone's benefit very quickly." "Of course," Gerald said. "Allow me to make the introduction." He turned toward me with the particular composure of a man who had been looking forward to this moment for several weeks. "Mr. Morgan, this is Leonard Hayes. He is the registered owner of the Hayes family collection and the authorizing party for all legal actions currently in process." Edward looked at me. I watched it happen, the recognition arriving in stages, the way a developing photograph emerges from blank paper. First the name, then the face placed now in context, then the wedding, the stone patio, the vineyard, the man whose wife had fallen into the mud while 300 people watched, the man whose son had stood at a microphone and called him penny pinching, the man he had never once spoken to directly in an entire weekend because he had assessed him in the first 5 minutes and categorized him as irrelevant. His attorney leaned forward and said something quietly into Edward's ear. Edward did not respond to his attorney. He was looking at me with the expression of a man watching the ground shift beneath his feet, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, terrible way of something that has been eroding for longer than he knew. "You," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, stripped of the boardroom register entirely. Just one word, flat and unguarded. I looked at him across the mahogany table. Outside, the Atlanta morning pressed hard and bright against the glass. "Hello, Edward," I said. "Thank you for coming. I think we have quite a bit to talk about." Edward's attorney put a hand on his client's arm. "Edward, let's hear what they have to say." Edward did not look at his attorney. He was still looking at me with the expression of a man trying to reassemble a picture he thought he understood, finding that the pieces do not fit the frame he had built for them. He pulled his chair in, placed both hands flat on the table, made himself breathe. "Mr. Hayes," the attorney said in the measured tone of a professional who had decided the best strategy was controlled civility, "my client came today to discuss a resolution to the collateral dispute. He maintains that he received the items in good faith without knowledge of their registration status, and that—" "I understand your client's position," I said. I reached down and placed the first folder on the table, slid it across the mahogany toward Edward. "Before we discuss resolution, I'd like Edward to look at something." Edward opened the folder. Inside was the lease agreement for the 3 warehouse properties that housed the logistics operations of Morgan Coastal Hotels. 9 years of renewals. The unglamorous operational backbone of everything he had built. I watched his eyes move to the bottom of the signature page. "Look at the name on the lessor line," I said. "The company signing your renewals since 2016. His attorney leaned over and read it. His expression did not change, but he sat back very slightly. Edward looked up at me. "Caldwell Property Holdings." His voice had dropped entirely. "That's you." "One of my subsidiaries," I said. "You have been leasing operational property from me for 9 years. I own the parking lots your delivery vans use. I own the loading docks where your event supplies are staged. You have written a check to one of my companies every single month since your second hotel opened. The loan officer from Coastal First was writing in his portfolio. Edward's attorney was very still. I placed the second folder on the table. This one covers the collateral situation directly. Edward opened it with hands that were no longer entirely steady. Inside were the Hartwell registration documents for all 7 pieces, the GPS tracking records showing movement from Savannah to Napa to Pacific Vault, and the formal stolen property notice filed with the FBI art crime team. Your loan application died the moment those pieces hit the compliance system, I said. The GPS records show exactly when they were moved and exactly how long they sat in your possession before you placed them in a bonded storage facility. The provenance check your appraiser failed to run would have identified the Hartwell registration in under 10 minutes. I kept my voice level. You chose Pacific Coast Valuation licensed, but not nationally certified. Under the American Society of Appraisers Professional Standards, that certification gap is not an accident. It is a choice. My client did not knowingly, the attorney began. Your client is a 20-year hospitality professional who accepted $12 million in antiques as a wedding gift and moved them into a bank's collateral process within 48 hours, I said. The question of what your client knew is one the federal prosecutor will enjoy examining in considerable detail. Edward's jaw was tight. A muscle moved along the side of his face repeatedly, involuntarily. I placed the third folder on the table, the thinnest one. A single document, the Morgan Coastal Hotels LLC shareholder registry. I slid it toward Edward and watched his eyes move down the page to the ownership breakdown. I watched them stop. Caldwell Heritage Trust, 48%. Voting shares. Established 11 years ago. That trust, he said. Barely a whisper. 11 years. I invested when your second hotel opened, I said. The fundamentals were sound. The location strategy was well considered. I believed in the concept. I folded my hands on the table. I am the largest minority shareholder in Morgan Coastal Hotels. I have been for 11 years. You have never known my name. His face was doing something complicated and painful. The slow, structural collapse of a man who had believed for decades that he was the smartest person in any room he entered, discovering that for 11 years he had been in business with someone he dismissed as irrelevant at his daughter's wedding. You watched me? He said, flat and exhausted. Not an accusation, just a statement. See, I watched my wife fall into a flower bed, I said, and I watched my son laugh. Those were the things I was watching. His attorney tried again. My client is prepared to return all 7 pieces immediately and sign a full liability waiver. In exchange, the pieces will be returned regardless, I said. The FBI case is not contingent on their return. Those are federal processes that do not require my participation to continue. Edward pressed both hands flat on the table again. His breathing was audible now, the deep, controlled breathing of a man fighting to keep himself from coming apart. What do you want? His voice cracked on the last word. Tell me what you want, and I will find a way to give it to you. I looked at the custom suit, the bruised eyes, the jaw that had not stopped clenching since he walked through the door. I want my wife's silver dress back, I said quietly. But that is not something you can give me. I stood up. What happens next is not something I control. The bank controls the foreclosure proceedings. The FBI controls the investigation. The federal prosecutor controls the charges. I am simply the man who owns the collection, the man who owns your lease, and the man who holds 48% of the company you built. I looked at him directly. And I am the man whose wife you watched fall into the mud while you stood there with a champagne glass and said nothing. Edward looked at his hands on the table. "Is Daniel going to prison?" he asked. "Raw and stripped entirely bare." "That depends on what he does in the next several weeks," I said. "I suggest you ask your attorney the same question about yourself." I picked up my briefcase. Gerald and Sandra were already gathering their materials. The loan officer had stopped writing entirely. I walked to the door. Behind me, I heard Edward's attorney begin speaking in urgent, low tones. I heard Edward say nothing in response. I stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind me. Daniel was waiting in the hallway. He was sitting in one of the chairs outside the conference room door, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes on the floor. He was wearing the same gray t-shirt he had worn to the workshop in Savannah 2 weeks ago, which told me either that he had not thought carefully about what to wear to an Atlanta law office, or that he had stopped caring about such things entirely. His attorney sat beside him, a heavy-set man in his 40s named Briggs, who stood when he saw me, and whose expression communicated that he had advised his client against being here, and had lost that argument. "He insisted on coming," Briggs said quietly to Gerald. "I know," Gerald said. "That's why I told him what time to arrive." Daniel looked up when he heard Gerald's voice. His eyes found mine and held them, and in that look was everything that had passed between us in the workshop: the photograph, the grain of the walnut, the things that could not be fixed, and the things that might yet be built from what remained. "They're still in there?" he asked. "Edward is still in there," I said. "I need you to come back in with me." Briggs started to object. Daniel stood up before his attorney could finish the sentence. "It's all right," he said. "I'll go in." The three of us entered the conference room. Edward looked up when the door opened, and his eyes moved from Gerald to me to Daniel, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw his son-in-law was not grief or anger, but something colder and more final, the expression of a man who has already decided where the blame belongs and is simply confirming the assignment. "You," Edward said to Daniel. The same word he had said to me 20 minutes ago, but carrying an entirely different weight. Daniel did not respond to Edward. He sat down in the chair beside me, not across the table beside me, and placed his hands flat on the mahogany and looked at the 3 open folders still spread in front of Edward and did not flinch. I reached into my briefcase. I placed a small digital recorder on the table between all of us. Sandra Cole straightened in her chair. Gerald folded his hands. Edward's attorney leaned forward. "On the 23rd of June," I said, "I received a phone call from my son. Georgia law permits a party to a conversation to record that conversation without notifying the other party. I recorded it. I would like everyone in this room to hear a portion of it." Briggs put his hand on Daniel's arm. Daniel shook his head once, barely perceptibly. "Let it play," he said. His voice was flat and very tired. I pressed play. The recording was clear. Daniel's voice filled the conference room, amplified and specific, and entirely without the context of an interrogation. Just a man on the phone with his father believing himself to be in a private conversation, saying the things he actually thought. I heard his own voice explain that he had taken the pieces from the basement. I heard him say he thought they were just old things, collector stuff. I heard him say he wanted to show Edward's family that he came from people with history and substance. I heard the exact moment he confirmed that he knew the code, had known it for years, and had used it without asking. Then I heard my own voice ask him what he thought would happen when Edward put them in front of a bank, and I heard Daniel say, "I don't know what I thought. I thought it would be fine. I thought they'd appraise them, use them for a couple months, and then I'd figure something out. I stopped the recording. The conference room was very still. The Atlanta skyline pressed bright and indifferent against the glass behind me. Edward stared at the recorder. His jaw was working the muscle along the side of his face, moving in the tight, involuntary rhythm it had maintained since he first sat down. His attorney had a pen in his hand and was not writing. Daniel was looking at the table. His eyes were wet, and his jaw was set, and his hands were still flat on the mahogany, and he looked like a man who had known this moment was coming and had spent 2 weeks deciding how to sit through it. That recording, Gerald said, addressing the room, establishes Daniel Hayes's voluntary admission that he entered the registered storage facility, removed 7 items he understood to be his father's property, and transferred them across state lines without authorization, with the intent that they be used for financial purposes. Combined with the GPS records, the security footage from the workshop, and the Hartwell documentation, it constitutes a comprehensive evidentiary package. Edward's attorney set down his pen. This was obtained without Georgia Code Section 161162, Gerald said. One-party consent. Mr. Hayes was a party to that conversation. The recording is entirely admissible. Edward pushed back from the table. He stood up. His chair scraped loudly across the floor. He pointed at Daniel, and his hand was shaking, not with grief, but with the particular fury of a man who has lost everything and needs somewhere to put it. "You did this," Edward said. His voice cracked down the middle. "My hotels, 20 years. Because you wanted to impress me with a pocket watch you stole from your own father." Daniel looked up at him. His eyes were red and wet, but his voice when it came was steadier than I expected. "I know what I did, Edward. I'm not going to sit here and let you pretend you didn't see exactly what you wanted to see and move immediately. I trusted you. You trusted $12 million, Daniel said. That's not the same thing." Edward's attorney was on his feet now, hand on Edward's arm. Daniel's attorney, Briggs, was leaning toward Daniel's ear. The loan officer had closed his portfolio entirely and was looking at the window. I stood up. I picked up the recorder and placed it back in my briefcase. "I'll be outside," I said to Gerald. I walked to the door. Behind me, I heard Edward's voice rising again, and Daniel's voice staying level in response, and the particular sound of 2 men who had used each other finding out simultaneously that the currency they had been trading in was never real. I stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind me. In my briefcase, the recorder's light had already gone dark. I was standing in the hallway when the elevator doors opened. Agent Rourke stepped out first, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent 20 years walking into rooms where the situation had already deteriorated significantly. He wore a dark suit and carried nothing except a leather credential wallet. Behind him came his partner, a younger agent named Castillo, who was carrying a manila folder and whose expression communicated that she had done this before and found it no less serious for the repetition. Gerald stepped out of the conference room and shook Rourke's hand. "They're both still inside," he said. "Daniel Hayes and Edward Morgan." "Warrants were signed this morning," Rourke said, addressing me directly. "Federal Magistrate, Northern District of Georgia. We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Hayes." "Do what you need to do," I said. Rourke nodded. He and Castillo walked to the conference room door. Rourke opened it without knocking. I followed them in. The room had the charged, depleted atmosphere of a place where 2 people have been arguing and have recently run out of things to say. Edward was standing near the window. Daniel was still seated, his attorney Briggs beside him with a hand on his forearm. Both of them looked at the door when it opened. and both of them understood immediately what the arrival of two individuals in dark suits with federal credentials meant. Rourke held up his wallet. Special Agent Rourke, FBI Art Crime Team. I have federal arrest warrants for Daniel Hayes and Edward Morgan. He looked at Daniel first. Mr. Hayes, you are under arrest for interstate transportation of stolen property in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 2314, and grand larceny under Georgia state statute. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Daniel's face went the color of old plaster. He stood up slowly, the way a person stands when their legs are not entirely certain they will hold. Briggs was already on his feet, saying something rapid and professional into his phone. Dad. Daniel's voice was barely a sound. He was looking at me across the conference room. His eyes were swimming and his chest was heaving, and everything he had held together for the past 2 weeks, the lawyer, the careful statements, the controlled exhaustion, dissolved completely in that moment. He looked 20 years younger and 20 years older simultaneously, which is what terror does to a face. Dad, please. Tell them just please. I walked toward him. Not quickly, deliberately the way I had walked toward the stage at the wedding reception. I stopped in front of my son. His chin was trembling. Tears were moving freely down his face. He reached out and gripped my forearm with both hands the way he used to grip the edge of the workbench when he was small and something had frightened him badly. I'm sorry, he said. His voice broke entirely on the second word. Dad, I am so sorry. For Mom, for the basement, for all of it. I am so sorry. My chest felt like it was being compressed by something slow and very heavy. I put my free hand over his. I held it there for a moment. I know you are, I said. I believe you. Then help me, please. You can stop this. No, I said. I cannot stop this. And even if I could, I would not. Because the thing you are sorry for is not a mistake, Daniel. It is a series of choices made deliberately over time, and the consequence of those choices is what is happening right now in this room. He was sobbing now, the full, unguarded sobbing of a man who has completely run out of composure. His grip on my forearm tightened. I love you, I said quietly. I have loved you every day of your life, but love does not cancel consequence. I learned that from my own father. I should have taught it to you sooner. I gently removed his hands from my arm. I stepped back. Agent Castillo moved forward, and Daniel did not resist as she guided his hands behind his back. The handcuffs made a sound in the conference room that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, sharp and final and entirely without ambiguity. Across the room, Rourke was reading Edward his rights. Edward stood at the window, his back very straight, listening to the words with the rigid composure of a man who has decided that dignity is the only thing left that cannot be taken from him. When Castillo finished with Daniel, Rourke's partner moved to Edward. Edward extended his wrists without being asked. The conference room door opened. Martha walked in. She was wearing the charcoal suit that matched mine, her silver hair pinned back, her posture straight and unhurried. Gerald had called her the day before. She had driven up alone that morning, which was like her. She stood just inside the doorway and looked at the room, at Daniel in handcuffs, at Edward, with his wrists extended at the 3 open folders still spread across the mahogany table. Daniel saw her. His sobbing stopped, as if a switch had been thrown. He stared at his mother across the conference room with the desperate, stripped-down expression of a child who has done something unforgivable and is looking at the person they have most hurt and finding that person standing completely upright. Mom. The word came out of him broken and small. Martha looked at her son. Her face was not hard. It was not cold. It was something more difficult than either of those things. It was the face of a woman who had loved completely and been betrayed completely, and had decided in the week since her silver dress was ruined in a Napa Valley flower bed exactly who she was going to be on the other side of it. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of Daniel. She looked at him for a long moment, at his red eyes and his shaking jaw and the handcuffs at his wrists. And then she said in a voice that was absolutely steady, "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it. Because I refuse to carry this for the rest of my life." Daniel broke open completely. His shoulders collapsed, and the sound that came out of him was not a word at all. Martha looked at him one more moment. Then she turned and walked to me and took my hand, and we stood together while Agent Rourke guided Daniel toward the door, and Edward followed without being asked. The conference room emptied slowly. When the door closed for the last time, and there was no one left in the room except the two of us and Gerald standing quietly near the window, I looked at my wife. Her hand was warm in mine. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set, and her back was straight, and she looked like exactly what she was, the strongest person I had ever known. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's go home." 4 months is not a long time when you measure it against 41 years. But the 4 months between the morning Agent Rourke walked into that Atlanta conference room and the morning my wife and I sat in the front row of a federal courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Richard B. Russell Building felt in ways I am still not entirely able to articulate, like a different kind of time entirely. Gerald had handled the procedural machinery with his usual precision, the cooperation agreements, the plea negotiations, the victim documentation. Hartwell returned all 7 pieces to the workshop basement in late July, each one intact, each one settling back into its velvet compartment, as though it had simply been away for a season. Daniel entered a guilty plea in September. His attorney Briggs had negotiated a cooperation agreement. Daniel provided a full written account of the timeline, the basement access, the transfer to Edward, everything. In exchange, the federal prosecutor agreed to a sentencing recommendation of 5 years rather than the maximum 10. Edward separately entered his own plea to receiving stolen property and accepted 4 years. On a gray Tuesday morning in November, Martha and I sat in the front row of the gallery with our hands in our laps and watched the 2 men who had dismantled our family walk into a federal courtroom in orange jumpsuits and chains. Judge Patricia Weller was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the particular composure of someone who had spent 2 decades watching people face the consequences of choices they had convinced themselves were justified. She addressed both defendants with the same level unsparing attention, not harsh, not theatrical, just precise. She noted Daniel's cooperation and the plea agreement. She noted Edward's acceptance of responsibility. Then she noted in a voice that carried clearly through the wood-paneled room that cooperation and remorse, while meaningful, did not diminish the nature of what had been done. She sentenced Daniel to 5 years in federal custody, Edward to 4 with a permanent bar on serving as a corporate officer or director. Daniel closed his eyes when the number was read. His jaw tightened and his shoulders dropped forward, and he pressed his lips together in the way of someone absorbing a blow they knew was coming, and still found heavier than expected. Edward received his sentence with the rigid composure he had maintained since the Atlanta conference room, back straight hands, still looking at no particular point in space. The prosecutor stood and announced that the court would now hear victim impact statements. Gerald had filed the paperwork for both of us 3 weeks prior. I walked to the podium. I adjusted the microphone. 300 people had watched me tear a check into pieces at a wedding reception 5 months ago. This room held perhaps 40, and they were quieter, and the weight in here was of a different kind entirely. I am not here to ask for more punishment, I said. The court has already determined what is appropriate. I am here because the law allows me to say what was lost, and I believe that matters. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at me. His eyes were red, and his face was the face of a man who had been living with what he had done for 5 months and had not found a way to make it smaller. My wife carried a tray of food to her son's wedding, I said. She did it because she wanted to make sure he had eaten on the most important day of his life. She was pushed off a stone patio into a flower bed for that. And the boy she raised, the boy I raised, laughed. I stopped for a moment. Let that word sit in the room. I have spent 5 months trying to understand how a child becomes a man who laughs at that. I have not found a satisfying answer. What I have found is that the answer does not matter as much as what you do next. I turned slightly, so I was speaking to the room, rather than only to Daniel. My son did not steal from me because he needed money. He stole because he needed approval. He needed someone else's opinion of him to be high enough to compensate for his own. That is a poverty that no amount of money addresses. And I say that as a man who made the mistake of believing that providing abundantly was the same as preparing thoroughly. I looked at Daniel one more time. I love you, I said. I will love you in 5 years when you come out of that building. But the man who comes out needs to be different from the man who went in. That is not my work to do. It is yours. I stepped down from the podium. And then Martha stood up. She did not look at the prosecutor or at Gerald or at Judge Weller for permission. She simply stood up from the front row and walked to the podium with the same unhurried, deliberate steps she had used to walk through the crowd at the wedding, carrying her tray in the last ordinary moment, before everything changed. She adjusted the microphone down 2 inches. She looked at Daniel. I practiced what I was going to say, she said. I had 3 pages. Gerald helped me write them. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out folded papers and set them face down on the podium without opening them. I don't need them. She looked at her son in his orange jumpsuit and his chains, and her voice when it came was the voice of a woman who had made her peace and was simply reporting the outcome. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, she said. For 35 years, that was true without qualification. I want you to know that I remember all of it. The science projects and the little league games and the mornings you came into our room before sunrise because you had a bad dream. Her voice thickened slightly, but did not break. I remember all of it, and none of it is canceled by what happened. It is just set beside it. And I have decided to look at both. She paused, took one breath. I forgave you in that conference room in July. I meant it then, and I mean it now. What I will not do is pretend that forgiveness makes the mud wash out of a dress I will never wear again. She looked at him steadily. Grow into someone worth forgiving. That is all I have to say. She picked up her 3 pages without unfolding them and walked back to her seat beside me. Daniel had his face in his hands. His shoulders were shaking with the particular grief of someone receiving a gift they know they do not deserve. Judge Weller looked at Martha for a moment with an expression that was not part of her official capacity, and then returned her attention to her paperwork. Court was adjourned. The November air outside the Richard B. Russell Building had the particular quality of Atlanta in late autumn, cool enough to feel like a change, not cold enough to be honest about it. Martha and I walked out through the heavy glass doors together, her hand in the crook of my arm, neither of us speaking, because we had said what needed to be said in that courtroom, and everything after it was simply the world continuing, which it does regardless. The parking structure was 2 blocks east. We were halfway there when I heard footsteps behind us moving quickly, and then a voice. Mr. Hayes. I turned around. Chloe Morgan was standing on the sidewalk 10 feet away. She looked nothing like the woman who had stood at the altar in Napa Valley 5 months ago, in a cathedral-length gown with her chin up and the absolute certainty of someone whose life was going exactly according to plan. She was wearing dark slacks and a wool coat that fit her poorly, the kind of coat bought quickly from a discount rack when the weather changed, and the money for a better one was not there. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her face was bare of the careful layered makeup she had worn at the wedding, and without it, she looked younger and considerably more tired, and entirely more real. She was holding a manila envelope in both hands, and she was gripping it the way people grip things when they are trying to keep their hands from shaking. "I was in the gallery," she said. "I sat in the back. I didn't know if you'd seen me." "I hadn't," I said. Martha had not moved away from my side. She looked at Chloe with the direct, steady attention she gave to things that required care. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the expression of a woman who had decided to be honest about what she felt, rather than perform something more comfortable. Chloe looked at Martha first. Her grip on the envelope tightened visibly. "Mrs. Hayes." Her voice was unsteady, but she held it. "I pushed you, at the wedding. I put my hands on you and I pushed you because I was angry about a dress and you fell, and I stood there while Daniel laughed and I didn't." She stopped, started again. "I didn't stop him. I could have. I didn't." Martha looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said quietly. "You didn't. But I'm sorry." The words came out of Chloe cracked and genuine, nothing performative in them, just the flat, exhausted sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be said to the right person. Her eyes were filling. "I am genuinely sorry. Not because of what happened to my father or Daniel or any of it. Because of what I did to you. Because you were carrying food to your son and I hurt you for it." Martha was quiet. Then she said, "I heard you." It was not forgiveness, and it was not rejection. It was simply acknowledgement, which was, I thought, exactly the right amount. Chloe looked at me. She extended the manila envelope. "My attorney filed the divorce petition last week. The marital asset review flagged some of Daniel's accounts. There are federal forfeiture claims attached, so most of it is frozen. I've been staying in my father's house, but the bank is moving forward with the foreclosure." She lowered the envelope slightly. "I don't have anywhere to go after the end of the month." "What's in the envelope?" I asked. "My resume," she said, "and a letter. I wrote it 3 times and I still don't think it says what I mean, but..." She held it out again. "I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking you to make anything easier. I need work. Real work. Something I can do with my hands and my time and actually earn." I looked at her. The wool coat bought from a discount rack. The bare face. The envelope held in both hands because her hands were not entirely steady. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I found what I was looking for and held it out. It was a business card. Hayes Restoration Workshop, Savannah, Georgia. The address of the carriage house I had rebuilt with my own hands in 1987. The phone number that rang the desk inside the workshop where the secretary desk had sat, finished and patient for 2 weeks before I moved it to its new owner. Chloe took it. She turned it over, read both sides. "That's my workshop," I said. "We restore antique furniture. The work is physical and detailed, and it requires more patience than most people have when they start. The hours are early. The pay is honest, and nothing more." I looked at her directly. "Call Monday morning and ask for my floor supervisor, Janet Briley. Tell her I referred you. She will decide whether to bring you on. That decision is entirely hers, not mine." Chloe looked at the card. Her throat moved. "Why?" she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. After everything. Because everyone who works in that building started somewhere they weren't sure about, I said. And because what you did at that wedding was cruel, but cruelty is not the whole of a person unless they decide it is. That decision is also entirely yours. Martha spoke. The dress, she said, simply looking at Chloe. The one I was wearing. Silver. It was ruined. Chloe looked at her. I know. I want you to know that I know you know, Martha said. That's all. It was again exactly the right amount. Chloe closed her hand around the business card. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying, which I suspected took considerable effort. Thank you, she said. She turned and walked back toward the courthouse, and I watched her go until she turned the corner, and then I looked at my wife. Martha was looking at the place where Chloe had been standing. Then she looked at me, and the expression on her face was the one I had loved for 41 years. Not uncomplicated, not performed just entirely and specifically hers. Ready? She said. I offered her my arm. She took it. We walked to the parking structure and got into our car and drove out of Atlanta into the November afternoon, heading south toward Savannah, toward the workshop and the smell of linseed oil and old wood and the particular quiet of a life built carefully over a very long time. Martha put her head back against the seat and watched the Georgia landscape move past her window, and after a while she reached over and put her hand on mine, where it rested on the gear shift, and she left it there. Neither of us needed to say anything else. We were going home. People hear a story like this, a family revenge story built on betrayal and stolen trust, and they expect the man at the end of it to feel victorious. I don't. What I feel is the quiet grief of a father who gave his son everything except the one lesson that mattered. God sees every choice we make, including the ones made in the dark with a key we were trusted with. I forgot to teach Daniel that. That failure belongs to me. If this payback story carries any lesson worth keeping, it is this: do not love your children by removing every consequence from their path. That is not protection. That is the slowest kind of damage. God did not build us to live without accountability, and no parent's devotion can redesign that. My wife carried a tray of food to her son's wedding because she loved him. She was pushed into the mud for it. And in God's particular way, every person in this story eventually stood in exactly the mud they had prepared for someone else. I am Leonard Hayes. I fix broken things for a living. Some things cannot be fixed. They can only be carried forward honestly. If this story reached you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe. There are more stories here. Every one of them carries something worth keeping.